Had it been successful, Turkey would have been taken back a few decades.
That's Turkey's Deputy Prime Minister saying a coup would have caused economic chaos. But it failed, and now Mehmet Simsek tells TRT World how Turkey will move on after what he calls a massive shock. Hello, I'm Matthew Moore in Istanbul. Welcome to a special edition of Money Talks. So Turkey's Deputy Prime Minister has told TRT World that the failed coup over the weekend was a massive shock and would have set the country's economy back decades had it succeeded. Mehmet Simsek is responsible for Turkey's economy, and we'll play our full interview with him in just a moment. But first, Azar Sukri looks at the events that shook the nation.
As rebel tanks blocked bridges and commandeered fighter jets flew low over Istanbul and Ankara, scared people started withdrawing money from ATMs. The seat of Turkey's democracy was bombed. At least 208 civilians and security forces were killed. But another casualty was the Turkish lira. The currency plunged by nearly 5% against the dollar. It was the biggest drop in 8 years. It's since regained some of its losses, but international investors remain nervous. Once markets reopened on Monday, stock prices in Istanbul plunged. The benchmark share index fell by 7%, with bank stocks coming under particular pressure. One of the first targets of the coup plotters was Istanbul's airports. Most flights were cancelled. Turkey's crucial tourism sector had already been feeling the pinch after several terror attacks this year. But the response from the authorities was swift. The central bank said it would offer unlimited liquidity to commercial banks, helping to cushion them against any major demands for cash. And Deputy Prime Minister Mehmet Simsek, who oversees economic affairs, had a conference call with international investors to assure them that the government was in charge and that there was no need to worry. He told the world that Turkey's economic fundamentals remained strong.
And what makes Mehmet Simsek so confident? Here's what he told TRT World's Hassan Abdullah in this extensive interview on the failed coup and Turkey's economy.
I would think that the fallout from the failed coup attempt for the economy is likely to be short-lived and insignificant. The reason is it doesn't feel real. I mean, it was so quick and people were able to overcome it, so swiftly that by Sunday, I was back in my office, and by Monday, everything was functioning reasonably well. So I'm not trying to underestimate the significance of the event. The event is huge. This was a massive shock, an extraordinary night, no question about it. And had it been successful, Turkey would have been taken back a few decades backward. There would have been chaos and, with unimaginable consequences for the economy, for the standards of living for Turkish people. But now that that has failed, I think chances are the impact is likely to be manageable, in the sense that most likely channel of impact would be like tourism. With all people watching all these events, already tourism was weak. But I would argue that it was such a swift sort of conclusion to the saga, the Friday night, that the impact is going to be limited. And more importantly, in the second half of the year, we do expect Russian tourist arrivals to recover. As you know, in the first half of the year, there was a complete ban by Russia. Now that there has been a reconciliation between Russia and Turkey, Russian tourists. So if you look at the first half of the year, our current account deficit, which is affected by tourism outcome, actually was narrowing. So relative to the end of 2015, current account deficit narrowed significantly. So the deficit was actually down to 3.7% of GDP from about 4.5% of GDP. So despite poor, weak tourism numbers. In the first quarter of the year, despite weak tourism, we had 4.8% real GDP growth. And in the second quarter, the numbers are not out yet, but growth momentum remained reasonably strong. So for the full year, in our program, we had penciled in 4.5% real GDP growth. So even if, let's say, the latest incident, the latest events have some impact on consumer, on investments, or on tourism, etc., we still think that a 4% real GDP growth would be a plausible scenario. So yes, maybe a modest sort of decline, but 4% real GDP growth would still be one of the highest growth rates among OECD members, in European Union, and among emerging markets. In fact, if you exclude China and India, last year, emerging market growth, emerging market universe average growth was about 1.7%. Turkey grew by 4%, so more than twice. So this year, it's likely to be a similar outcome. So we're still likely to have a fairly respectable rate of growth and continue to create plenty of jobs. Over the last 12 months, Turkey has created over 1 million jobs. Last year, we had a balanced budget. This year, we're looking at a modest deficit. Last year, as I said, we had a current account deficit of 4.5% of GDP. This year, we're looking at a modest decline, an improvement in the deficit. So overall, if you look at the big picture Turkish economy, fundamentals are strong. The events of Friday will not change that. In fact, if anything, it's likely to strengthen the case for Turkish macro in the medium longer term. Why? Two reasons. First of all, the fallout in terms of politics is not there. Political stability has been strengthened because President Erdogan has proven to be right on his concerns about these rogue elements within the state, this parallel state. So there were among some segments of society, among some other opposition parties, there were question marks about his push to cleanse the system of these remnants, of these parallel terrorist, whatever now I would say organization. Because we've seen on Friday night, essentially terrorists in military uniforms killing civilians, attacking the parliament, etc. You've seen that. So what I'm trying to say here is this. Political stability has been strengthened. I think there is also a very good atmosphere, environment for domestic political reconciliation. Because all political parties had the right stance, a strong stance against the coup attempt. That brought us closer together. Right. And President Erdogan has already thanked the opposition leaders, and we had an extraordinary session of parliament where everybody was so constructive. I haven't seen that kind of atmosphere for the past 9 years. I've been, a member of parliament for a fairly long time. So I would argue that considering that the political backdrop has improved, I think that makes it easier to continue to push structural reforms through the parliament. Now, so a combination of improved political stability with a better environment for structural reforms, I would argue that actually beyond short-term impact, which, as I said, would be manageable, relatively insignificant. Therefore, I think the case for stronger growth, for stronger macro performance is there.
Now, the central bank had said that it will provide banks with unlimited liquidity in the aftermath of the attempted coup. Now, is this a signal that the government and central bank are perhaps anticipating a run on the commercial banks?
Well, as you may remember, on Friday night, people didn't know what was happening and how that would end up, how that saga would conclude. So some people did rush to withdraw money from ATMs. On Saturday, I was back from my constituency because on Friday night, I was actually in my constituency in Gaziantep, which is right on Syrian border. It's a relatively large city with nearly 2 million population. So I traveled on Saturday, and on Sunday, very quickly, I got in touch with Central Bank Governor, with Undersecretary of Treasury and other departments, and we needed to put together a contingency plan to deal with the aftermath of the failed coup and to make sure that the fallout for Turkish economy would be negligible or manageable or minimal. And that's exactly what we did, and we've been fairly successful. So on Sunday, we decided to reassure investment community, to reassure domestic banks and everybody. We said we would provide unlimited lira liquidity, and we would provide $50 billion FX liquidity, and it could even increase more. So we came out with the right framework to make sure that there was no state of panic. And in fact, yesterday, can you believe it? You experience a very serious, a very vicious coup attempt. Yet it failed, but still it's a massive shock. And on Monday, all the markets are open, fully operational, functioning, with absolutely no problems. Yes, there was some repricing of asset price. Asset prices were repriced. Equities were down a bit, currency was weak somewhat, and rates were up a bit. But to be honest with you, when you look at yesterday's market volatility or market moves, it's no different than any other sort of day in terms of when a major news flow emerges or a major event is happening. So it doesn't feel like there was actually, a coup attempt on Friday. That's why it wasn't just, us being. We were not concerned about run on bank because I think Turks got the right message. And yesterday it was very interesting. At a time when international investors were walking away from some of their positions, meaning liquidating some of their positions, we saw Turkish households coming in and selling hard currency for lira. So their confidence in Turkey, their confidence in the economy, and that's why relative to, let's say, over the weekend, where US dollar lira exchange rate was over 3, actually, at some point, it was trading somewhere between 293 to 297, 298. But what I'm trying to say is that relative to the weekend, actually lira strengthened. Why? Because domestic investors, Turkish households, Turkish people have more confidence about their future, more confidence in the economy. So that was interesting. And so absolute no run. We were not worried about a run, but still, we wanted to reassure investment community, saying, look, we're here to help, to make sure that market functions. We understand if you want to reprice assets, we'll let the adjustment take place, but we are here to help. This is extraordinary. I was on a conference call on Sunday. On Sunday morning, we got in touch with 3 global investment banks. We said, can you host a conference call with global investment community? And for the first time, 3 separate banks joined forces. And they agreed to host. Even though the initial report was that 560 investors were on the call. The final report was that 804 investors were actually on the call listening from Asia Pacific to Europe and to the United States. It was a 2-hour, 15-minute sort of conference call where I had a brief introduction, and later on, I took I took questions until we had, all questions exhausted. So, provide them with backdrop as to what has happened, what next, and what sort of impact. So I think those efforts have been influential, meaning have had a positive impact on investor confidence. And yesterday, as I said, the volatility was relatively manageable, and I think that's why the fallout for both Turkish financial sector, Turkish politics, and Turkish economic activity, Turkish growth, is likely to be limited, short-lived, manageable.
Is the government thinking about imposing capital controls?
Absolutely no.
Now, we also noticed that inflation is running higher than the EU average and is high even compared to other upper middle income economies. So how does the government plan on combating this?
There are a couple of rough spots in Turkish economy. One of them is relatively high inflation. If you go back to pre-AK Party rule, the current government rule, you have 3-4 decades of double-digit, some occasionally slipping into triple-digit inflation, double-digit inflation, double-digit interest rates, double-digit depreciation on an annual basis. So today's Turks, a big chunk of today's generation, actually grew up in an environment of double-digit inflation. My government was successful in achieving a lasting reduction in inflation. So we were able to reduce inflation to single digits. But it's been stuck somewhere between 5 to 7% on average. So the challenge for us is to reduce inflation to low single digits, meaning to below 5%. In the medium term, our target is 5%. Beyond that, we hope that through structural reforms, we'll be able to reduce inflation to low single digits, about 1 to 3%. I think it's doable, but it requires improvement in Turkey's productivity, in competitiveness, but also eliminating barriers to competition, etc. So we're working on that. It requires a structural effort, but of course monetary policy also needs to be, obviously, the top priority is price stability. Monetary policy needs to be more credible and more effective, and hopefully it is going to be over the next few years.
Now, there are some reports that some 1,500 officials from the finance ministry have been dismissed. If true, what sort of an impact would that have on the economy and also on the administration of the finance ministry?
Not yet dismissed. These are people who probably Ministry of Finance believe that they're either sympathizers of this sort of movement that perpetuated the failed coup, or some of them may be complicit. So I don't know. I'm not well versed on all details, but they're only been suspended. So it's a precaution. Those, temporarily, their ability to serve in their positions, so has been for now suspended.
Right.
There's going to be a legal process. So ultimately, the prosecutors and Turkish courts will decide whether or not there is proof that these people are, complicit or part of this network, which is now illegal and has been designated as a terrorist organization. So the rule of law will prevail. So whatever we do, it will be within the scope of rule of law. It's not, so they're not dismissed. For now, they've been suspended. there will be a scrutiny, there will be an investigation.
Now, there are also some reports that some of these officials were working on a post-coup economic plan. Is that true, first of all?
Well, that's one of the reasons why some of these actions are taken. So don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm seeing some assessment globally. Instead of condemning this horrible coup, you're talking about a terrorist organization within the Turkish army that tried to butcher Turkish democracy. I mean, these terrorists in military uniforms attacking the parliament, attacking civilians, using warplanes against your own people. I mean, this is shocking. So we need to investigate what's more to it, because, it's such, this is unbelievable. I don't know what sort of, adjective to use to describe these people. So yes, I mean, apparently they had designated a rear admiral as a new central bank governor. So, all the details are now coming out. We've uncovered this thick instruction book by the coup perpetrators, those guys. So we're going to look into what's behind. I can't verify that there is such work, but surely they must have been working for months and months. It seems like a very elaborate plan, going beyond just, forcefully, interrupting democracy and, establishing a military regime. Before the rest of the world judges Turkey's action within this context, we would recommend them to be patient and to trust that everything that will be done within the scope of rule of law.
Right. And finally, is the Finance Ministry working alongside the Justice Ministry in trying to get Gulen back to Turkey? Because it seems that in the US system, if you highlight financial misconduct as opposed to terrorism, then the extradition process may become easier.
Well, yes, of course. We have Financial Intelligence Unit, which is under Ministry of Finance. And it looks at money laundering and terrorist financing. And we have close cooperation with many other international agencies within the scope of FATF. And of course with US Treasury. In fact, on that, or other issues, we have close cooperation. So MASAC, which is this Financial Intelligence Unit, within the Ministry of Finance, has already uncovered plenty of material on these terrorist organization. And therefore, yes, I'm sure in the file that would be submitted to the United States, those evidence will be supplied. More importantly, let's look at U.S. Patriot Act. U.S. Patriot Act actually is so so strong that it says that even if somebody unknowingly, contribute to, let's say, a foundation that turns out that has support for terrorism, that those guys could actually be prosecuted. So, it's so, strong. So I think the case is a fairly strong one. People always ask for evidence. Yes, there is evidence. Yesterday I was on, again, some other networks, and that question was, asked me, and I was asked that question, and I said, look, there was this Gulen movement affiliated, police chief in Istanbul. After the politically motivated, let's say at that time, efforts back in late 2013, early 2014, those guys were investigated and finally were kicked out of the police force. On Friday night, in one of the tanks, this guy who is not a civil servant, who is not an army personnel, this guy who's been sacked and that been prosecuted, and there is a court decision that this guy is involved in these parallel whatever activities, rogue activities. So he's been kicked out of the force. He turns out in a tank with a military uniform and attacking Istanbul security headquarters, police headquarters. So, there is so much evidence that actually linked the coup perpetrators to these terrorist movement, this parallel movement, this rogue movement, whatever you call it. So yes, absolutely.
Well, that was Turkey's Deputy Prime Minister Mehmet Simsek talking to TRT World's Hassan Abdullah in Ankara about the impact of the failed coup on Turkey's economy. Well, this is, of course, an ongoing story, which we will be following closely here on Money Talks in the coming days. But for now, that's it for this special edition of the programme. From me, Matthew Moore, and the whole team here in Istanbul, thank you for watching.